In today's video, we're delving into 3 of the darkest true crime stories that have left the world in shock and disbelief. First, a young beauty queen's untimely death, a case surrounded by chilling mysteries and unanswered questions. Next, the sudden disappearance of a pregnant woman on Christmas Eve, unfolding into a gripping courtroom drama that exposed shocking secrets. Finally, the murder of a British exchange student in Italy, a case that sparked international intrigue and endless controversy. If you're drawn to the darkest true crime stories delivered in a gripping story format, then you've come to the right place. Please subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our intense weekly uploads. Alright, let's dive into today's harrowing stories. It was early in the morning on December 26, 1996, when JonBenét Ramsey's life was tragically cut short. The day began like any other for the Ramsey family, but what followed would haunt them forever. The previous evening, JonBenét had attended a Christmas party with her family, a celebration marked with laughter, gifts, and cheer. No one could have foreseen that this seemingly perfect night would end in horror. The events began with a chilling discovery. Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother, woke up early and went downstairs, only to find a ransom note placed on the stairs. It was an oddly lengthy letter, filled with demands for $118,000, an amount that mirrored John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus. As she read the note, panic set in. Her 6-year-old daughter was missing, and the words on the page hinted at the unimaginable. "Help us get your daughter back," it seemed to say, but there was a dark, unsettling feeling that lingered. Patsy immediately called her husband, John Ramsey, to come downstairs. Panic gave way to confusion. The note, with its peculiar tone and strange requests, seemed to be part of an elaborate scheme. But who would want to harm their little girl? Why would anyone go to such lengths? John rushed down the stairs and took control of the situation. He and Patsy scoured the house, hoping JonBenét had just wandered off, maybe playing a game or hiding as young children sometimes do. But as the minutes ticked by, their worst fears began to take shape. Their daughter wasn't hiding. She was gone. The house was silent, save for the frantic voices and the pounding of their hearts. John, in desperation, called 911. The operator's calm voice contrasted with the panic in his. "My daughter's missing. I need help," he shouted into the phone. As he spoke, his voice cracking with fear, the house remained eerily quiet. The 911 dispatcher, sensing the urgency, instructed John to stay on the line and try to stay calm. Minutes later, the police arrived at the Ramsey home, a large, sprawling mansion on Pine Street in Boulder, Colorado. The scene was chaotic, but there was something about the way John and Patsy behaved that caught the officers' attention. They were upset, certainly, but the situation didn't seem to add up. Why was the ransom note so long, so specific, yet oddly impersonal? Why was there no sign of forced entry? No broken windows, no signs of struggle. It was almost as if JonBenét had disappeared into thin air. As officers combed the house, they found nothing to explain her disappearance. There were no clues, no broken locks, no sign of an intruder. Yet, something didn't sit right. In the basement, the police discovered a small, almost hidden door that led to a dark storage room. And there, in the corner of the room, lay JonBenét's lifeless body covered by a white blanket. It was the kind of moment that sent chills down the spine of anyone who witnessed it. The child, a vibrant, bright-eyed girl with a love of beauty pageants and singing, was now just a cold, silent figure. Her small body, bruised and battered, lay still in that dark corner, a haunting symbol of the terror that had occurred within the walls of her own home. John Ramsey, still in a state of disbelief, was the one to identify the body. His words, barely a whisper, echoed in the police officers' minds. "It's JonBenét," he said, as if his voice could somehow make the reality of the situation easier to bear. But nothing could. The police now had a grim task ahead of them. They had to investigate a crime scene that seemed to offer more questions than answers. There was no obvious cause of death, no obvious signs of violence beyond the injuries JonBenét had sustained. The ransom note was cryptic and bizarre, but was it real? Was this some kind of twisted joke? Or was there a deeper, more sinister truth hidden within? The entire town of Boulder was about to be thrown into chaos. What had happened to JonBenét Ramsey? And who could possibly have been behind it? The investigation would go on to consume the lives of the Ramseys and captivate the nation. But in this moment, as JonBenét's body lay cold in the basement, all anyone could do was wonder how such a senseless, brutal crime could happen to someone so young, so innocent. As the hours passed, the police continued their investigation, combing through every inch of the house, every possible clue. But nothing made sense, and the questions only multiplied. In the hours that followed JonBenét's discovery, the focus of the investigation quickly turned to the mysterious ransom note. It was unlike anything investigators had seen before. A single sheet of lined notebook paper, filled with unsettling demands and eerie instructions. The note was specific in its monetary request, $118,000, an amount that seemed strangely personal, matching John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus to the penny. The timing of the request, right after Christmas, felt calculated, as if the perpetrator had done their homework. But what struck investigators most was the note's bizarre tone and phrasing. The note read as though it had been written by someone trying too hard to sound menacing, but it fell flat. It was littered with contradictions. The writer demanded a large sum of money, but also left behind clues that seemed to point back to the Ramsey family itself. Phrases like, "We are a group of individuals who represent a small foreign faction," were meant to add an air of mystery, but they only raised more questions. What group? What foreign faction? The inconsistencies were glaring. Why would a kidnapper make such strange statements, almost as though they were trying to disguise their identity, yet reveal so much about their own intent? The first thing that stood out was the length. The ransom note was over 2.5 pages long. That wasn't the typical brevity of a kidnapping demand. It was almost theatrical. The rambling language, filled with stilted phrases and odd requests, was unlike the cold, efficient demands of most criminals. The note was filled with references to the family's good fortune and the wealth of your business, as if the writer knew intimate details about John Ramsey's life. But there was something else, a feeling of manipulation woven throughout the letter. The writer seemed to demand more than just money. They wanted control, power. It wasn't just about a ransom. It was a twisted display of dominance. The note instructed the Ramseys to follow certain steps. Get the money, place it in a brown bag, and wait for further instructions. But the note also included several odd instructions that would later be scrutinized. The writer insisted on secrecy, warning the Ramseys not to contact the police, threatening dire consequences if they did. There was also an emphasis on timing. The money was to be delivered within a certain time frame, and the writer made it clear that any deviation from the plan would result in harm coming to JonBenét. The police quickly realized that there was a deeper issue with the ransom note. It didn't fit the usual profile of a kidnapping. There was no call for proof of life, no clear demand for the safe return of the child. In fact, the note almost seemed to be setting up a scenario where the Ramseys would feel compelled to negotiate, yet there was no clear way to do so. It was as if the writer wanted to create a stage, a performance, and the Ramseys were the unwitting actors. As investigators analyzed the note further, they discovered more disturbing details. For one, the handwriting seemed to be carefully constructed, yet it didn't seem entirely natural. It appeared that the writer was trying to disguise their identity. There were no obvious indicators that the note had been written by someone with a strong grasp of the English language. The word choices felt off, almost as if the writer was struggling to communicate in a way that would seem foreign. The letter contained multiple mistakes, spelling errors, and awkward phrasing that suggested a rushed or frantic attempt to appear organized and deliberate. But the strangest part of the note was the signature. The writer made a point of signing off with the phrase "Victory," SBTC. This cryptic ending raised even more questions. What did it mean? Who were they? The initials felt like another deliberate attempt to confuse, to leave investigators grappling with uncertainty. The focus was no longer just on JonBenét's disappearance, but on the odd figure behind the note. Was this person truly after money? Or was there something darker at play? As the hours passed and the investigation grew, the ransom note remained a key piece of evidence, but its authenticity was called into question more and more. Was it really a ransom demand, or had someone fabricated it to divert attention from something else? The more the investigators studied the letter, the more they questioned its true intent. Was it a legitimate demand from a kidnapper? Or was it some kind of carefully orchestrated misdirection? There were also concerns over the timing of the note. It was found in the morning, long after JonBenét had likely been killed. If this was truly a kidnapping, why had the note been left behind so late? Why hadn't the kidnapper contacted the family sooner, especially if they were so intent on collecting the ransom? The fact that the note was discovered in the early morning hours raised more questions about the timeline of the crime. The Ramseys' behavior also came under scrutiny. Patsy and John had been frantic when they first called the police, but there was a strange sense of composure about them once the police arrived. They seemed to be following the actions of people who had been through a crisis before, but their actions felt too rehearsed. Some even wondered if they had been involved in writing the note themselves. Could it be possible that the note had been staged as part of a larger, more complicated plot? Or was it just the work of a single, deranged individual? For the police, every detail of the ransom note was a potential lead. But it also set them on a path filled with contradictions, each new piece of evidence opening up more avenues of investigation, while also clouding the picture. The note was a puzzle, one that didn't seem to fit together no matter how hard anyone tried to make sense of it. With JonBenét's body discovered, and the ransom note as the only tangible clue, the investigation began in earnest. But from the moment the police arrived at the Ramsey home, the scene felt more like a maze of confusion than a clear-cut crime scene. Officers were faced with a disturbing reality. A young child was dead, her life stolen in the heart of her own home. Yet, there was no sign of forced entry, no immediate clues pointing to an outsider. It was a case shrouded in uncertainty, where every possible explanation only seemed to lead to more questions. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the family members, focusing primarily on the parents, John and Patsy Ramsey. There was an undeniable tension in the air as investigators tried to reconcile the outwardly composed demeanor of the Ramseys with the shock of such a horrific event. It wasn't that the parents were suspicious, but their behavior was unusual in a way that made it hard to look past. John, a wealthy businessman, and Patsy, a former beauty queen, had been in the public eye before, and now their lives were laid bare for the world to see. The pressure to prove their innocence, or guilt, was immense. As police searched the house, they found more strange details that didn't fit the profile of a typical kidnapping. There was no sign of struggle in JonBenét's room, no indication that she had been taken against her will. Her bed was neatly made, and there were no signs that anything had been disturbed. The room was eerily untouched, as though the child had simply vanished without a trace. But as the hours ticked by, investigators began to question the legitimacy of the ransom note itself. The note was the only real evidence, yet it was far too elaborate to be a straightforward demand. Why had the kidnapper gone to such lengths to write an over-the-top letter with no clear way to contact the family? And why, after all the elaborate details, had the kidnapper not made any attempt to communicate further or follow up on their request? It was as if the note was designed to confuse and manipulate, a tactic that felt more personal than criminal. Despite the oddities surrounding the note, the theory of an intruder persisted. The Ramseys insisted that someone must have broken into the house. They maintained that they had no idea who would want to harm their daughter, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the evidence didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints on the ransom note, and no trail left by the supposed intruder. It seemed like the perfect crime, except for one glaring detail. The note itself, and the circumstances surrounding it, didn't fit the typical pattern of a kidnapping gone wrong. As police pieced together the timeline, they realized that JonBenét had likely been dead for hours before her body was found. The cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head along with strangulation, was evident, but the scene still held mysteries. There were no obvious signs of sexual assault, though there were strange marks found on her clothing and traces of a strange material that couldn't immediately be identified. The more investigators examined the scene, the more they questioned everything they had assumed about the case. John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey were immediately placed under scrutiny. Their statements about what had happened in the hours leading up to the discovery of their daughter's body didn't line up with the evidence. John had initially told police that he had never left the house after returning home from his business trip on Christmas night. But that wasn't entirely true. He had been seen outside, in the driveway, carrying something. Investigators quickly noted the inconsistencies in the timeline and began to dig deeper. Meanwhile, the media was already circling. The story was becoming a sensation, with news outlets reporting the smallest details, often with little regard for the accuracy of the information. The Ramseys, now the center of the investigation, were thrust into the limelight with their every move scrutinized. Patsy was interviewed multiple times, her emotional outbursts playing out on national television. John, on the other hand, was more reserved, but his every action was dissected, and whispers began to spread. As investigators continued their search, the feeling of unease grew. The more they uncovered, the more the case seemed to turn inward. The idea of an intruder was starting to seem less and less likely, but they had no clear suspect to point to. The ransom note, once the key to unlocking the mystery, had only deepened the enigma. The Ramseys' behavior became more difficult to explain as the days passed. John Ramsey's insistence that there had been no break-in, combined with his calmness in the face of such a tragedy, made some investigators uneasy. Patsy's behavior was equally perplexing. She had been distraught during the 911 call, but once the police arrived, her actions seemed almost too composed, too rehearsed. They were the parents of a murdered child, but they were acting like two people caught in a carefully scripted drama. To some, it looked like they were playing a part, one that didn't seem to align with the horror of the situation. Detectives began to wonder, was there something in the Ramsey household that the family wasn't telling them? Had the murder been a result of a botched kidnapping scheme, or was it possible that the crime was far closer to home than anyone dared to consider? The more they investigated, the more the line between family and suspect blurred. The case grew murkier as the investigation shifted its focus from one theory to another. Forensic experts continued to comb through the evidence, looking for any shred of information that might point to an intruder or to the Ramseys themselves. As the hours turned into days, the case remained a mystery, one that seemed to mock the investigators with its complexity and contradictions. Yet, deep down, everyone knew that the truth was out there, somewhere hidden beneath layers of confusion and doubt. The tension mounted. The family was under suspicion, but there was still no clear evidence to support it. As the police worked tirelessly to unravel the layers of deceit, it became painfully clear that whoever was responsible for JonBenét's death had left behind a trail of false leads, broken timelines, and misdirection, none of which led directly to the killer. As news of JonBenét Ramsey's tragic end spread, the media quickly seized on the story. The case became an overnight sensation, splashed across front pages, television screens, and radio stations. Reporters descended on Boulder, Colorado, each network vying for the latest twist in a case that had all the hallmarks of a headline-grabbing mystery: a wealthy family, a beautiful young victim, and a crime shrouded in secrecy. The story had everything to capture public fascination, and it soon became clear that JonBenét's case would not fade quietly from public view. Almost immediately, the media frenzy began to shape public perception. Speculation ran wild as new leads and theories were reported with little verification, creating a blurred line between fact and fiction. The Ramseys became the focal point, their lives dissected and scrutinized as the press cast them alternately as grieving parents or potential suspects. Every moment of their public appearances was analyzed, every facial expression judged, and every word examined for signs of guilt or innocence. Some reporters were openly critical of the family, pointing to the ransom note's unusual language and the seemingly flawless staging of the crime scene. Others questioned why Patsy Ramsey had placed the 911 call before conducting a thorough search of the house, and why she sounded so controlled. These nuances, when taken out of context, painted a picture that invited endless conjecture. Rumors spread that the Ramseys were protecting someone close to them, that they had something to hide. The family's wealth and social status further fueled speculation that they were using their influence to manipulate the investigation or steer suspicion away from themselves. With the investigation unfolding under the glaring light of media scrutiny, pressure on law enforcement grew intense. Every day, news anchors and columnists demanded answers, questioning the competence of the Boulder police and speculating that they were out of their depth. The police were navigating an incredibly sensitive case, but the constant barrage of public criticism only added to the challenges. Under normal circumstances, they could focus on gathering evidence and forming a coherent theory. Now, however, they faced constant calls for quick results and public accountability. The relentless media coverage also influenced the investigation itself, creating a feedback loop in which public opinion began to seep into police tactics. Leaked details were rehashed, and even small discoveries became the subject of endless scrutiny. Detectives, hoping to divert attention, became cautious about sharing information, fearing that any statement they made would be misconstrued or twisted to fit a particular narrative. But by then, the case had taken on a life of its own, as armchair detectives, pundits, and true crime enthusiasts all weighed in with their theories and suspicions. One of the most damning aspects of the media coverage was its portrayal of Patsy and John Ramsey. The press painted them as cold, detached, and even complicit, magnifying any behavior that seemed unusual. Their public relations team encouraged them to make a televised appeal, a plea for information that might lead to their daughter's killer. When they appeared on camera, however, their composed demeanor was seen as unfeeling. The public's judgment was swift and unforgiving. Instead of grieving parents, they were viewed with suspicion, their every gesture and response dissected as evidence of supposed guilt. As the weeks wore on, a division emerged in the theories surrounding JonBenét's death. On one side, there were those who believed in the intruder theory, pointing to possible signs that an outsider could have accessed the home and carried out the crime. Proponents of this theory argued that an intruder would be more likely to write a rambling ransom note in a desperate attempt to cover their tracks, especially if the crime had not gone according to plan. Yet, there was no physical evidence to definitively link anyone outside the home to the crime. No unknown fingerprints, no foreign DNA. Those supporting the intruder theory struggled to explain how someone could enter, commit such a terrible act, and vanish without leaving a single incriminating trace. On the other side of the debate were those who believed the crime was an inside job. To them, the lack of forced entry, the overly theatrical ransom note, and the eerie calm of the Ramsey family pointed to a cover-up. Some speculated that a family member had accidentally caused JonBenét's death, and the elaborate staging was meant to deflect blame. This theory seemed to align with the evidence, or rather, the lack of it, inside the house. Yet, it was a theory largely fueled by circumstantial evidence, and in the absence of a confession, it was impossible to prove. Meanwhile, as the investigation stretched on without any significant breakthroughs, the public grew impatient. News specials, tabloid exposés, and televised debates continued to shape the narrative. Detectives worked tirelessly behind the scenes, but each new piece of evidence led them only deeper into a labyrinth of contradictions and dead ends. As months turned into years, JonBenét Ramsey's case remained unsolved, a mystery that cast a lasting shadow over Boulder and captivated the nation. The initial investigation had led nowhere definitive, leaving behind two main theories, one that suggested an intruder had slipped into the Ramsey home and committed the crime, and another that speculated the answer lay within the family itself. Yet neither theory could be proven, and both were plagued by unanswered questions. The case was at a standstill, held hostage by its own complexity. For those who favored the intruder theory, the idea was simple. Someone had entered the home, intent on carrying out a planned crime. Supporters pointed to a partially opened window in the basement, which they believed could have provided a possible entry point. Some investigators noted a small footprint found near JonBenét's body that did not seem to match anyone in the household. But even these details felt tenuous. No traces of a stranger's DNA were found, no definitive signs of forced entry, and no physical evidence to support the presence of an outsider that night. The theory, while plausible, struggled to hold up under closer examination. An alternative explanation involved an unusual piece of evidence, a flashlight found in the kitchen, left in a spot that felt out of place. Some suggested that the flashlight had been used during the crime, its heavy base potentially explaining the blunt force injuries JonBenét had suffered. Yet, even this detail remained speculative, with no clear link to either an intruder or a family member. Meanwhile, the theory of family involvement continued to gain attention. This line of inquiry was based on the notion that a member of the household might have accidentally harmed JonBenét, and then staged an elaborate cover-up to protect themselves. Supporters of this theory noted inconsistencies in the family's accounts and unusual behaviors that seemed to hint at a staged scene. The ransom note, in particular, was often cited as evidence. Its length and strange language suggested a sense of pretense, an attempt to construct a scenario that would shift suspicion away from the family. But the family theory was not without its own problems. The Ramseys had always insisted on their innocence, and over the years they repeatedly cooperated with law enforcement, and even hired independent investigators to search for leads. Patsy and John Ramsey, despite their public struggles, continued to fight to clear their names. They even took polygraph tests, which they passed, though these results were met with mixed reactions. While some saw the polygraphs as proof of their innocence, others questioned the reliability of the tests and argued that the results could be influenced by psychological factors, especially under such emotional stress. In an attempt to clarify the case, investigators conducted extensive DNA testing, hoping to find new insights that would shed light on JonBenét's last moments. Over time, several rounds of testing were performed on samples collected from her clothing. In 2008, a DNA profile from an unknown male was detected on JonBenét's clothes, leading the Boulder District Attorney to publicly declare that the evidence pointed toward an intruder. This announcement seemed like a breakthrough, reigniting hope that the case might finally be solved. However, the DNA was only a partial profile and did not match anyone in the FBI's database or any of the primary suspects in the case. This revelation, though significant, ultimately led investigators back to the same question: if not the Ramseys, then who? As the years passed and new developments slowed, JonBenét's case became a fixture in true crime media, a haunting reminder of justice unfulfilled. Documentaries, books, and television specials continued to revisit the case, each one proposing new theories and analyzing old evidence in an attempt to uncover the truth. Yet, the deeper the public delved into the details, the murkier the case became. Theories ranged from the plausible to the outlandish, and each one seemed to further blur the line between fact and fiction. The Ramseys, for their part, were never able to escape the weight of suspicion. The loss of their daughter, combined with the relentless scrutiny, took a profound toll on the family. Patsy Ramsey passed away in 2006, still maintaining her innocence and vowing to find justice for her daughter. John Ramsey continued the search, though he retreated from the public eye, weary from years of being under suspicion. For him, the quest for answers was personal, a final effort to restore his family's honor and find peace in the wake of unimaginable loss. To this day, JonBenét's story remains one of America's most infamous cold cases, a tragedy that refuses to let go. The unanswered questions continue to haunt the case, and every few years, a new theory or discovery briefly rekindles interest. Yet, despite all the attention, the truth remains elusive. In the end, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey is a mystery that may never be fully resolved, a heartbreaking reminder of how justice, even when pursued tirelessly, can sometimes remain out of reach. The next story is called Laci and Connor's Law. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Laci Peterson's life would come to an end in the most chilling of ways, though at the time, no one had any idea how brutal her fate would soon become. It started like any other Christmas Eve. The morning air was cool and crisp in Modesto, California. The Petersons were preparing for a family gathering, the kind of day that should have been filled with joy, celebration, and anticipation. But for Laci, it would be the last day she ever saw the world. Laci, a 27-year-old woman with a glowing smile, was known for her warmth and caring nature. She was 7.5 months pregnant, expecting a baby boy, Connor. Her life, by all appearances, was on track. She had a loving husband, Scott Peterson, and was looking forward to becoming a mother. But on that fateful morning, something went terribly wrong. As the clock ticked closer to noon, Scott told his wife that he was going out to the marina to fish. He'd been doing it regularly lately, and Laci was content to spend the day finishing up her holiday preparations. They exchanged a few brief words and Scott left their house, heading out into the chilly December day. But it was the last time Laci's family would ever see her alive. The morning seemed uneventful at first. Laci spent the time wrapping gifts and preparing a fruit salad. She had plans to meet her family later that afternoon for a traditional holiday meal. But by the time Scott returned home, just a few hours later, Laci was nowhere to be found. Scott arrived back at their home around 5:15 p.m., but Laci wasn't there. Her car was parked in the garage, her keys and purse still inside the house, and the family dog, a golden retriever named Mackenzie, was left alone in the yard. No one knows for sure what happened in the hours between when Scott left and when he returned. But Laci was gone. Without a trace, The first thing Scott did was call Laci's mother, Sharon Racha. He seemed panicked, as anyone would be in that situation. He told her Laci was missing, and that he had no idea where she was. Laci's family immediately started searching the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking anyone they could find if they'd seen her. But the hours stretched on with no word. By 10:30 p.m., the police were called, and the search for Laci Peterson officially began. The Modesto Police Department responded quickly, treating the case as a missing persons investigation. But even in the early hours of the investigation, there was something unsettling about Scott's demeanor. He seemed unusually calm, as though the situation didn't quite match the emotional outpouring one might expect from a husband whose wife had just disappeared. Neighbors reported seeing Laci walking their dog earlier in the morning, but nothing in the immediate area indicated that she had been abducted or had wandered off on her own. The search began to widen, with officers combing through the neighborhood and local parks. Yet, as night fell, the search turned up nothing. There was no sign of Laci Peterson anywhere. By the morning of December 25th, Christmas Day, the police were becoming more concerned. It had been over 12 hours since anyone had seen Laci, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were growing more suspicious. Scott's insistence that he had no idea where his wife had gone seemed odd. Why had she left the house on Christmas Eve, and why hadn't she been in touch with anyone? More importantly, why was she gone without taking any personal belongings, including her purse or keys? The investigation was starting to feel like something was off. Scott had claimed he went fishing at the Berkeley Marina, a small, desolate spot far from home, but no one could corroborate his story. The marina was largely deserted on Christmas Eve, and there were no witnesses to confirm that Scott had actually been there. There was also no evidence of any fish in his boat when he returned. What? Still, Scott seemed convinced that his wife would turn up soon. He reassured friends and family that she must have just run off, maybe gone for a walk or gotten lost. But as the hours ticked on, and no one could find any trace of Laci, suspicion began to creep in. What had happened in the time between Scott leaving for the marina and his return? Why had Laci simply vanished without a trace? The only evidence left behind was the Peterson home, untouched, except for the strange absence of Laci. Over the next few days, the investigation deepened, with Laci's disappearance becoming more and more mysterious by the hour. Detectives began to piece together the details of Scott's story, and though it initially appeared as if he was just a distraught husband, there were little things that started to not add up. His timeline didn't seem to match up with the evidence that had been found, and there were inconsistencies in his retelling of the events of that Christmas Eve. Scott's odd behavior was beginning to raise red flags, but the police were careful not to jump to conclusions. What they didn't know yet, though, was that the disappearance of Laci Peterson would soon become a high-profile case. It would shock the nation and draw the attention of millions. But at this point, all they had was a young woman missing from her home, and a husband who seemed to be hiding something. As the days passed and Laci's absence stretched into weeks, the world was left to wonder, what happened to Laci Peterson? Where was she? And more importantly, who was responsible for her disappearance? The pieces of the puzzle were just beginning to fall into place, and the truth was about to shatter everything. Scott Peterson's life was about to be turned upside down. Little did he know, the answers to the questions surrounding Laci's disappearance would soon become much darker than he ever expected. And on April 13, 2003, when the remains of Laci and her unborn son were discovered, the full extent of the crime would be revealed, setting the stage for one of the most sensational trials in American history. But at that moment, as Christmas came and went without a trace of Laci Peterson, no one could have predicted the horrors that were about to unfold. As the days passed, Laci Peterson's disappearance began to cast a dark cloud over the Peterson family. The police had no concrete leads, and Scott Peterson, though cooperative, remained the only person who could shed light on what happened. But the more detectives dug into Scott's life, the more questions began to surface. By December 26th, just 2 days after Laci went missing, the investigation was already looking into Scott's alibi. He had told police that he had gone fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, located more than 90 miles away from Modesto. Yet, there were no signs of anyone fishing at the marina that day, and no witnesses could confirm Scott's account of where he had been. When police asked him about his movements, his story seemed to be full of holes. He had claimed to have left the house early in the morning, but there was no proof he had been anywhere near the marina. For Scott Peterson, the pressure was beginning to mount. The police, while not accusing him outright, had started to look into his background more thoroughly. They discovered inconsistencies in his statements. For example, he had claimed to have been fishing in a remote area of the marina, but when investigators asked for more details, he became evasive. He also had trouble recalling specific times and events from that day. Scott's memory seemed patchy, and his responses felt rehearsed. The authorities were beginning to question whether his calm demeanor was genuine, or if it was hiding something darker. And then came the revelation that would change everything. Scott Peterson was having an affair. Detectives soon discovered that Scott had been secretly seeing a woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno, California. Amber had no idea that Scott was married, let alone that he was expecting a child with his wife. Their relationship had begun in November 2002, just weeks before Laci's disappearance. When the police contacted Amber and told her about Laci's disappearance, she was stunned. But soon, she became an important part of the investigation. Amber's testimony painted a disturbing picture of Scott Peterson. She claimed that he had been emotionally distant and manipulative, telling her that he was separated from his wife. Scott had even gone so far as to suggest that his wife was no longer in the picture, but that he was still grieving. For weeks, he had lied to Amber about his relationship with Laci, feeding her the story that he was going through a difficult divorce. But now, with Amber coming forward, the lies began to unravel. Amber agreed to help the police, and her phone calls with Scott were recorded. In one of the most telling moments of their relationship, Scott told her that he was a free man, and that his wife was no longer in the picture. It was a chilling comment, knowing that Laci was still very much alive at that time, and Scott's cavalier attitude suggested that he was already planning his life without her. The police began to connect the dots, and the picture they were forming was starting to look increasingly grim. Scott's strange behavior, his lies about the fishing trip, his affair, and his increasingly suspicious responses to the investigation pointed in one direction. Scott Peterson was involved in Laci's disappearance. But the evidence was still circumstantial. No physical evidence had been found linking Scott to the crime. There was no murder weapon, no clear motive, and no eyewitnesses. But the longer the investigation continued, the more the authorities began to focus on Scott. On January 24th, 2003, nearly a month after Laci went missing, the police took a dramatic step. They arrested Scott Peterson. He was charged with 2 felony counts of murder: the first-degree murder of Laci Peterson and the second-degree murder of their unborn son, Connor. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. It was hard to comprehend how the man who had once been seen as a grieving husband could now be the prime suspect in the murder of his wife and child. Scott Peterson's arrest marked the beginning of a media frenzy. News outlets across the country followed every development of the case. Cameras captured Scott as he was led out of his home in handcuffs, his face stoic and emotionless. He had been the subject of suspicion for weeks, but now the evidence had reached a boiling point. The nation was captivated by the mystery of Laci Peterson's death, and the arrest of Scott Peterson only fueled the growing obsession with the case. But even though Scott was in custody, the full details of Laci's death remained unclear. The investigation was far from over, and police still had many questions. How had Laci died? Where had Scott taken her? And what had motivated him to kill his wife, especially considering the baby they were expecting? These questions would drive the investigation forward, leading the authorities to uncover more details that would shock the public. On April 13, 2003, a breakthrough came. The bodies of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor, were discovered in San Francisco Bay, about 10 miles from the marina Scott had visited on Christmas Eve. The discovery would forever change the course of the case. The remains were found floating in the water, and while Laci's body was intact, Connor's body was found several feet away. The fact that Connor had been so clearly separated from his mother raised new questions about the circumstances of their deaths. The discovery of Laci's body was a critical moment in the investigation. The authorities could now confirm that Laci had been murdered. But the details surrounding her death were still shrouded in mystery. What had happened on the morning of December 24? How had Scott Peterson gone from a loving husband to a murderer? And why had he gone to such lengths to cover up his crime? As the investigation continued to unfold, the focus shifted from Scott's arrest to the mounting evidence against him. The discovery of Laci's remains, the phone records revealing his lies to Amber, and the growing number of witnesses who came forward, all of these pieces of the puzzle were coming together. But there were still many unanswered questions, and the investigation was only just beginning to uncover the full scope of Scott Peterson's involvement in Laci's death. The public's interest in the case was about to reach new heights as the pieces of the story continued to fall into place. As Scott Peterson's arrest reverberated throughout the nation, the media frenzy reached an all-time high. The case was no longer just a local tragedy, it had become a global spectacle. People were glued to their screens, watching every twist and turn in the investigation and trial. Scott's stoic face, his apparent indifference as he was led into court, became a symbol of the mystery that now surrounded him. Was he a grieving husband caught in a nightmare? Or was he the cold, calculated killer that so many suspected him to be? The trial began on April 1st in 2004, more than a year after Laci's body was found, and the courtroom became the stage for a battle between two powerful narratives. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jerry Brown, painted Scott Peterson as a man who had meticulously planned and executed the murder of his wife and unborn child. The defense, on the other hand, argued that there was no concrete evidence to prove Scott's guilt, suggesting that Laci's death could have been the result of an outside force or even a random act of violence. What unfolded in that courtroom would shock the nation and change the way the public viewed the case forever. The prosecution's case was compelling. They laid out a timeline of events that pointed directly to Scott. According to the prosecution, Scott had murdered Laci on Christmas Eve, wrapping her body in a blanket and then transported her to the marina, where he dumped her in the water. They argued that Scott's motive was simple. He wanted to be free of his wife so he could continue his affair with Amber Frey. Scott's extramarital relationship had been a central piece of the puzzle, and the prosecution used it to show that Scott had no moral compass and was capable of anything to get what he wanted. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against Scott was his behavior in the days following Laci's disappearance. Detectives testified that Scott had acted strangely during his interviews with police. He was calm, almost too calm, considering the gravity of the situation. While Laci's family and friends were visibly distraught, Scott's demeanor was unsettling. His lack of emotion, his failure to show any real signs of grief, painted a picture of a man who wasn't mourning the loss of his wife, but rather was trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away. The prosecution also focused heavily on the phone calls Scott had made to Amber Frey during the time when Laci was missing. They used the recorded phone calls to show that Scott had lied to Amber, even while Laci's body was being found in San Francisco Bay. In one chilling conversation, Scott referred to himself as a free man, suggesting that he was already thinking about his future without his wife. The defense tried to downplay these calls, claiming that Scott was simply trying to protect Amber from the details of his life. But the jury couldn't ignore the stark contrast between Scott's actions and the grief-stricken husband they expected him to be. As the trial unfolded, the defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence linking Scott directly to the crime. No murder weapon had been found, and the forensic evidence was largely circumstantial. They argued that the timeline presented by the prosecution was flawed, and that there was a possibility that Laci had been abducted by someone else, someone who was still out there, free and unknown. The defense also attempted to cast doubt on the investigation itself, claiming that the police had rushed to judgment. They accused the detectives of focusing too much on Scott from the beginning and failing to explore other leads. They questioned the integrity of the investigation and tried to present the case as a rush to convict a grieving husband without sufficient evidence. But the prosecution countered with its own set of bombshells. Forensic experts testified about the location where Laci's body was found, close to the marina Scott had visited on Christmas Eve. They suggested that the manner in which her body was disposed of pointed to a deliberate act. The fact that Connor's body was found separately raised additional questions. Was it possible that Laci had died from natural causes, and that Scott had disposed of her body in a panic? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The jury listened intently as the trial dragged on for months, and the drama in the courtroom only intensified as more evidence came to light. There were dramatic moments that gripped the nation, surprising revelations, tense cross-examinations, and witness testimony that seemed to suggest more and more that Scott Peterson was the orchestrator of a cold-blooded crime. Throughout the trial, Scott sat in silence, his hands clasped before him, occasionally exchanging glances with his defense attorneys, but never showing the emotion that everyone expected him to. His calmness was unnerving. His eyes, often empty, gave nothing away. Some wondered if he was a man who had orchestrated the perfect crime, while others questioned whether he was simply a man caught in a web of lies, now facing the unthinkable consequences. But as the trial neared its conclusion, it became clear that the prosecution had made a compelling case. The jury deliberated for more than 7 days, weighing the evidence and wondering if there was more to Scott Peterson's story than met the eye. In the end, the question remained, could they convict him beyond a reasonable doubt? The public's opinion was divided. Some believed Scott was guilty from the start, while others felt that the evidence didn't prove his guilt with absolute certainty. On November 12, 2004, after a month of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Scott Peterson was guilty of 2 counts of murder, first-degree murder for the death of Laci, and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn child, Connor. The verdict was read aloud in court, and Scott Peterson remained stone-faced, his emotions unreadable. For the Peterson family, the verdict was both a relief and a painful reminder that Laci's life had been tragically stolen from them. Scott Peterson's conviction was not the end of the story, though. While the jury had found him guilty, the question of his punishment remained. Would Scott face the death penalty, or would he be sentenced to life in prison? This question, too, would captivate the public's attention as the case entered the sentencing phase. Would the man who had been convicted of such a brutal crime receive the ultimate punishment, or would the court show him mercy? The answer would ultimately lie with the jury, and their decision would be a final chapter in a case that had consumed the nation for years. As Scott sat in his prison cell awaiting his fate, the haunting image of Laci Peterson, the smiling, vibrant young woman who had been taken from her family, remained. The tragic end to her life and the devastating loss of her unborn son would never truly be forgotten. For the Peterson family, and for all who followed the case, the trial was a grim reminder that the truth can be far darker than anyone ever imagines. And as the legal battle raged on, the public continued to question, how could a man so seemingly ordinary have committed such an unimaginable crime? As Scott Peterson sat in a crowded courtroom awaiting his sentence, tension filled the air. The jury's verdict had left no doubt about his guilt in the minds of the public. Now, the question was whether he would be sentenced to life in prison, without parole, or receive the death penalty. The prosecution argued passionately for capital punishment, presenting Scott as someone who had planned and executed a horrific crime. Laci's family, devastated by their loss, hoped the court would bring them some measure of justice. The sentencing phase unfolded with intense testimony from both sides. Friends and family members of Laci spoke about the profound impact her death had on their lives. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, delivered a heartfelt statement describing the pain and grief she endured each day without her daughter and grandson. The depth of her loss resonated with everyone in the courtroom, her words carrying the weight of her shattered heart. The defense argued for leniency, trying to portray Scott as a man who had lost his way, but did not deserve to pay with his life. They highlighted the absence of direct evidence, no eyewitness, no murder weapon, and contended that sentencing Scott to death would be a miscarriage of justice. However, their arguments struggled to make an impact given the overwhelming circumstantial evidence and Scott's own actions, which seemed calculated rather than remorseful. After hearing the emotional testimonies and reviewing the evidence one last time, the jury ultimately decided Scott's fate. They recommended the death penalty. Scott sat expressionless as the sentence was read. For him, it was the end of any remaining hope he had for a life beyond prison walls. The court's decision was later finalized, and Scott Peterson was officially sentenced to death by lethal injection. The sentence did not bring true closure to Laci's family, but it did bring a sense of justice. The years of uncertainty, the endless questions, the haunting memories of Laci's final days, all weighed heavily on those who loved her. Yet, the conclusion of the trial marked a turning point. Laci's loved ones could now focus on honoring her memory rather than seeking justice. In the days following the trial, public debate continued to swirl around the case. Some questioned the jury's decision, arguing that Scott's conviction relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. Others saw the verdict as a powerful statement, a reminder that the justice system had prevailed in holding a husband accountable for betraying his wife and unborn child. But even as the court proceedings concluded, Scott's legal battles were far from over. Scott's defense team launched an appeal, hoping to overturn his conviction. They argued that media coverage had tainted the jury, making it impossible for him to receive a fair trial. Over the years, this case would undergo numerous reviews and hearings, with new motions filed in an attempt to reduce Scott's sentence or gain a retrial. His legal team fought tirelessly, asserting that the high-profile nature of the case had influenced the outcome and violated Scott's rights. However, Laci's family remained steadfast, determined to protect her legacy. They fought against the appeals, showing up to every hearing, unwavering in their resolve. For them, Laci was more than just a name and a headline. She was a beloved daughter, sister, and friend whose life was cut short in an unimaginably cruel way. Years after Scott Peterson's sentencing, the legacy of the case continued to linger, drawing interest and sparking debates among the public. The unanswered questions and intense media scrutiny led many to wonder if the entire truth had been uncovered, or if there were lingering mysteries left unexplored. As Scott pursued every legal avenue, he became something of a national obsession. Books, documentaries, and television specials dissected every aspect of the investigation, the trial, and the lives impacted by Laci's tragic death. This widespread coverage painted the case as one of the most haunting stories in American true crime history. While Scott's legal team filed appeals, they argued that crucial evidence had been mishandled, witnesses had been biased, and the pervasive media coverage had corrupted the jury pool. They contended that Scott's story deserved another hearing, believing that a new trial might provide a fairer outcome. These appeals, though controversial, were backed by enough legal reasoning to gain traction in court, prolonging the ordeal for years as judges reviewed his case. In 2020, Scott's death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court, though his conviction was upheld. This reversal shocked Laci's family and reignited public interest in the case, sparking renewed debates. The court cited errors during the jury selection process, determining that potential jurors had been unfairly dismissed for opposing the death penalty, even though they had assured they could impose it if required by law. However, Scott's conviction for the murders remained, as the court found that there was still sufficient evidence to uphold his guilt. While the family grieved over the decision to overturn the death sentence, they were relieved that Scott remained in prison. For Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, and the rest of her family, every court appearance and media report brought back the raw pain of losing Laci and Connor. They continued their fight, remaining vocal in the pursuit of justice for Laci and her unborn child. For them, the appeals and media coverage were painful reminders, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Meanwhile, public debates around the case touched on broader societal issues. Some questioned the influence of media in high-profile cases and its impact on jury impartiality. The saturation of news, headlines, and special reports about Laci's disappearance had turned the case into a media spectacle, and it raised concerns about whether justice had truly been served, or if public opinion had unduly swayed the legal proceedings. This case had put the role of media and its influence on the judicial process in stark focus, prompting calls for reform in how high-profile trials are handled in the future. Other voices in the conversation focused on the tragedy of domestic violence and the painful reality faced by families who lose loved ones to such violence. Laci's story became a rallying point for awareness, spurring campaigns and legislation around protecting women and addressing the warning signs in abusive relationships. Although Laci had not reported experiencing harm before her death, her case spotlighted the underlying risks some women face, often hidden from view until it's too late. Her story became a symbol of the need to take suspicion seriously, to offer support to those in vulnerable situations, and to create stronger safeguards for women in potentially unsafe environments. For Scott, the story was not yet over. With his death sentence removed, he faced the possibility of a retrial, a prospect that kept the case alive in the media. Scott continued to maintain his innocence, and his defense team sought new avenues to appeal for his release. In a case that had taken such a devastating toll on so many lives, the possibility of Scott's freedom remained an ongoing source of pain and concern for Laci's family. For the Peterson family, the loss of Laci and Connor was an unending heartache. Their absence created a void that no amount of justice or media attention could fill. Sharon Rocha became an advocate for victims of violent crime, using her voice to ensure that her daughter's legacy was not forgotten. Through interviews, public appearances, and her own writings, Sharon kept Laci's memory alive, using the platform created by this tragedy to advocate for families who had faced similar losses. In the years that followed, Laci's story became a cautionary tale and a reminder of the need for vigilance and compassion. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, the image of a smiling Laci, full of life and joy, remained a haunting reminder of all that was lost. Though the case had spurred changes in the legal system and raised awareness of domestic violence, it left behind an unshakable sense of loss, a bright life taken far too soon, leaving a community, a family, and a nation to grapple with its aftermath. And so, the legacy of Laci Peterson endures, a tragic chapter in true crime history. The questions raised, the grief endured, and the lives touched by her story remain forever etched in the public's consciousness. While the legal system continued its work, and the public continued to debate, Laci's family found solace in remembering the woman they loved and the child who never had the chance to live. Through all the court hearings, the media coverage, and the societal changes her case inspired, the true memory of Laci Peterson endures, not just as a case or a headline, but as a beloved daughter, sister, and mother-to-be, who left an indelible mark on those who knew her. The next and final story is called the Amanda Knox case. On November 1st, 2007, in Perugia, Italy, the city's quiet cobblestone streets were about to become the scene of a horrific crime that would captivate the world. In the early hours of the morning, Meredith Kercher, a 21-year-old British student, was found murdered in her apartment. What seemed like a tragic accident, the result of a botched robbery, quickly spiraled into a case that would puzzle investigators, polarize public opinion, and create a media frenzy. Meredith had been living in Perugia as part of a university exchange program. Like many students studying abroad, she had left her family and friends back home to explore a new country, a new culture, and the freedom that came with independence. She shared an apartment with 3 other students: Amanda Knox, an American who was also studying at the University of Perugia, Rafael Solicito, Amanda's boyfriend, and a young woman named Filomena Romanelli. Meredith was well liked among her peers, described as friendly and quiet, but always keeping to herself, focused on her studies and a small circle of close friends. The night Meredith died, she had been spending time with a friend, and, as was often the case, the others in the apartment had their own plan. Amanda Knox had gone out with Rafael to celebrate Halloween, leaving Meredith alone in the apartment. Filomena, who was also out, hadn't been home either. There were no signs of struggle at first, just the cold, stark reality of a young woman's life cut short. At around 11:30 p.m., Amanda Knox and Rafael arrived back at the apartment. Amanda had a key, but the door was locked, and when they couldn't get in, Amanda decided to climb through a window at the back of the house. Once inside, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The house smelled different, foul, and off. It was in that moment that the unease began to settle in, and her heart rate likely started to climb. She called out for Meredith, but there was no response. Walking through the apartment, Amanda went upstairs to Meredith's bedroom. And then, there it was. Meredith's lifeless body sprawled across the floor. Blood had pooled around her, and it was clear that something horrific had happened. A scream echoed through the apartment. Amanda, in shock, immediately dialed the police. The police arrived within minutes, and the scene that greeted them was one of both chaos and confusion. The apartment looked like it had been ransacked, but there were no signs of forced entry. The door to Meredith's room had been locked from the inside, which didn't fit the typical narrative of a home invasion. The initial assumption was that Meredith had been the victim of a botched burglary, but it soon became clear that something much darker was at play. The scene was disturbing, but what caught the attention of the investigators was the gruesome nature of the crime. Meredith had been violently attacked, her throat had been slashed, and her body left in a state that suggested an unbridled rage. But the most chilling detail was that her blood had been used to write on the wall near her body. The words were not in Meredith's handwriting, but they would later be linked to Amanda Knox, a detail that would later send the case spiraling into controversy and confusion. Amanda, still in a state of shock, was initially seen as a victim, a young woman who had come home to find her roommate brutally murdered. But as the investigation continued, something began to feel off. Amanda's behavior, from the way she reacted at the crime scene to her interactions with the police, didn't quite fit the narrative of a grieving friend. She seemed detached, even indifferent at times. The public and the police began to question, could Amanda have been involved in Meredith's death? In the days that followed, the police would begin to piece together a theory of the crime that would include not just Amanda, but also Rafael Solicito, her boyfriend. They both appeared to be at the scene of the crime in the hours leading up to Meredith's murder. Their statements didn't align with the evidence, and their alibis started to fall apart. But the police weren't just focused on them. There was also the discovery of DNA evidence in the apartment, some of which belonged to Amanda and Rafael. However, what was more damning were the inconsistencies in their stories. It was clear that something wasn't adding up. As investigators combed through the apartment for evidence, one thing became clear. There was no straightforward answer. Everything seemed to point in different directions, and the case only became more complicated with each passing day. Who had killed Meredith Kercher, and why? The answers wouldn't come quickly. And as the story began to unfold, the world was introduced to a case full of contradictions, accusations, and one of the most high-profile legal battles in recent history. The investigation into Meredith's murder was far from over, and what seemed like an open and shut case of a robbery gone wrong was about to turn into something much more sinister and much more confusing. The answers that everyone was searching for wouldn't come easily, and for Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito, their lives would never be the same again. Within hours of Meredith Kercher's body being discovered, the investigation was underway. The police had already begun to question the people closest to Meredith, her roommates, Amanda Knox, and Rafael Solicito. The crime scene was unsettling, and something about the entire situation felt off. The scene of the crime, the lack of forced entry, the locked door, and the brutality of the attack seemed to tell a story that didn't fit the usual narrative of a burglary gone wrong. For the investigators, the case was no longer a simple robbery, it was a homicide, and the search for answers was just beginning. The police turned their attention to Amanda and Rafael almost immediately. Amanda's odd behavior at the crime scene had raised suspicions, and soon, she and Rafael were brought in for questioning. From the very start, their stories didn't seem to match up. Amanda had claimed that she had gone out with Rafael to celebrate Halloween and had returned to find Meredith dead. Yet, the timeline didn't make sense. How had Amanda and Rafael managed to return to the apartment and access the crime scene so quickly after Meredith's body had been discovered? Amanda's odd behavior only fueled the growing suspicion. Instead of showing the expected signs of grief, she appeared overly calm, even somewhat disinterested in the proceedings. She was at times cheerful, even laughing, as though she wasn't fully comprehending the gravity of the situation. In contrast, Rafael remained mostly quiet, but his interactions with the police did nothing to dispel the notion that something was amiss. As the questioning continued, new details began to surface that didn't align with the initial version of events. For example, Amanda had claimed that she and Rafael had gone to a nearby pizza restaurant, but police found that there was no record of the two being there. And then, there were the inconsistencies between what Amanda and Rafael had told the investigators and what they had told each other during their initial interviews. The cracks were starting to show, and the police were beginning to suspect that they might be hiding something. But there was another aspect of the case that was deeply troubling: the evidence, or lack thereof. Despite the brutal nature of the crime, there were no obvious signs of a struggle between the victim and her attacker. Meredith's room had been locked from the inside, and there were no fingerprints found at the crime scene, leaving investigators puzzled as to how the killer had gained access to Meredith's room. More importantly, despite the grisly nature of the murder, there were no immediate clues pointing to a clear suspect. One of the most perplexing pieces of evidence was the bloody footprint found near Meredith's body. The print didn't match any of the people living in the apartment, nor did it match the shoe prints of anyone known to have been in the area. It was a mysterious, inexplicable mark that seemed to suggest there was more to the story than what anyone had imagined. But as the investigation continued, it was revealed that the footprint belonged to none other than Rudy Gitt, a man who would later become one of the most controversial figures in the case. At the time, however, The investigators had no way of knowing this, and the suspicion around Amanda and Raphael continued to grow. They were questioned for hours, and their conflicting statements coupled with their strange behavior only deepened the mystery. It wasn't long before both Amanda and Raphael became the primary suspects in the case. But the investigation was far from over. The police were far from convinced that Amanda and Raphael were the only ones responsible for the murder. And as the days went on, new evidence continued to surface, raising even more questions about what had really happened that night. One of the most shocking revelations came when investigators found DNA evidence linking Amanda and Raphael to the crime scene. A small amount of Meredith's blood was found on Amanda's clothing, and traces of her blood were also discovered on Raphael's shoe. The DNA evidence was damning, and many believed it pointed directly to their guilt. But even more troubling was the discovery of a small piece of a broken glass in the hallway near the entrance to Meredith's room, a piece of evidence that seemed to suggest someone had entered the apartment through the back door, a door that Amanda and Raphael both claimed they hadn't touched. With the mounting evidence against them, Amanda and Raphael were arrested and charged with the murder of Meredith Kercher. They were placed in custody, and the media quickly descended on the case, turning it into an international spectacle. The world watched as Amanda's life, which had once seemed so full of promise, began to unravel in the public eye. But, despite the evidence, there were still questions that remained unanswered. Theories about the crime began to circulate, and many wondered if Amanda and Raphael were being unfairly targeted, or if they were truly involved in Meredith's death. The investigation had uncovered numerous contradictions, and the pressure was mounting on the police to find out the truth. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation continued to evolve, and the twists and turns of the case left more questions than answers. There was still no clear motive, and no one seemed able to piece together the full story of what had happened on that fateful night. The case had become a puzzle, with every new piece of evidence raising more confusion and suspicion. Was Amanda guilty? Was Raphael? Or was someone else involved altogether? The investigation had only just begun, and the hunt for the truth would lead the authorities and the world down a path that would forever change the lives of those involved. As the investigation intensified, the stakes grew higher for Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito. What had started as a tragedy, a young woman found brutally murdered in her apartment, was quickly morphing into a tangled web of confusion, suspicion, and controversy. The police were no longer treating Amanda and Raphael as mere witnesses. They were now prime suspects, and soon, the evidence they had hoped would prove their innocence began to be used against them. Amanda's strange behavior during her questioning was one of the most critical elements that fueled suspicion. At times, she seemed almost detached from the horror of what had occurred. When she was first questioned by the police, her odd reactions, her laughter, her calm demeanor were enough to unsettle anyone who witnessed it. The media latched onto this, portraying Amanda as an enigmatic, almost cold figure. Her every move was dissected, and with each new report, the public perception of Amanda shifted from a grieving friend to a possible killer. But it wasn't just her behavior that raised eyebrows. As the police dug deeper, they found inconsistencies in her story, details that didn't align with the physical evidence. For example, Amanda had originally told police that she had been out with Raphael at a local bar when Meredith was killed. But upon further scrutiny, it was revealed that there was no record of the couple being at the bar that night. They had no solid alibi, and the timeline was beginning to unravel. Meanwhile, Raphael's own story was equally confusing. He had claimed that he had spent the evening with Amanda, but as the investigation progressed, his statements also began to contradict the available evidence. The most damning piece of evidence was a DNA sample found at the crime scene that linked both Amanda and Raphael to Meredith's room. DNA traces were found on Meredith's clothes and on a knife in Raphael's apartment, a knife that would later be suggested as the possible murder weapon. The discovery seemed to confirm their involvement in the crime, and the pressure on them mounted. The investigation was far from straightforward, though. Despite the mounting evidence, there were still gaps in the story. For one, there was no clear motive for the murder. Amanda and Raphael had no apparent reason to want to harm Meredith. They had all been students living together in relative peace. But despite this lack of motive, the police were pressing hard for an answer. And as more forensic evidence came in, the authorities seemed determined to close in on the couple. Amanda, still maintaining her innocence, struggled to make sense of the mounting accusations. She would later describe how she felt, caught in a web of miscommunication and confusion, unable to understand how the investigation had shifted so suddenly from finding Meredith's killer to focusing on her. She had already begun to feel the weight of the media spotlight, and the pressure from the outside world was intensifying. But things were about to take a turn. The police had begun to focus on another individual who had been present in Perugia around the time of the murder. Rudy Gade, a young man from Ivory Coast with a criminal record. Gade had been seen at the scene of the crime, and his DNA had also been found at the crime scene, on Meredith's body, as well as in her room. His presence at the scene cast doubt on the theory that Amanda and Raffaele were solely responsible. But as the investigation deepened, Gade's involvement became even more suspicious. Despite his clear link to the crime, the police initially hesitated to bring him in as a suspect. It wasn't until later that they realized Gade had fled the country and was hiding in Germany, where he was eventually arrested. Gade's fingerprints were found in Meredith's apartment, and he was tied to the murder not only through DNA, but also through his own bizarre behavior. He had been the one to break into the apartment through the window, something that Amanda and Raffaele had denied. Gade's story was full of inconsistencies, just like Amanda and Raffaele's, but it seemed the police were reluctant to admit they had made a mistake in focusing so much of their attention on the two students. As the trial began to take shape, the case only grew more complicated. The world was watching. Media outlets from all over the globe descended upon the courtroom, sensationalizing every moment, focusing on Amanda's every word, every glance. The pressure on the defense team was immense. Every move, every argument was scrutinized by the public. And as the trial began, Amanda's fate hung in the balance. The court proceedings were chaotic. The defense argued that Amanda and Raffaele were being falsely accused, pointing out the lack of concrete evidence tying them directly to the crime. They argued that the DNA samples found in Meredith's apartment were inconclusive, and that there was no clear indication that Amanda and Raffaele were responsible for the murder. But the prosecution was relentless, pushing the theory that the pair had conspired to kill Meredith in a brutal act of violence. For Amanda, the trial was a nightmare. She faced a media that was already convinced of her guilt. Her emotional state fluctuated wildly. One moment, she was composed. The next, she was visibly shaken, struggling to keep her emotions in check. In a way, she had already been convicted in the court of public opinion, and it felt like the legal system might follow suit. It seemed as though no matter what she did or said, the truth would remain elusive. The trial became a circus, a spectacle that overshadowed the actual crime. The focus shifted from Meredith's tragic death to the drama of the trial itself. Amanda became the center of attention, her every word scrutinized. Raffaele, on the other hand, remained quieter, his role in the case seemingly more passive, but no less significant. The two of them were now linked not just by their past relationship, but by a case that was unraveling in front of the world. Amidst the chaos of the trial, something began to shift. The evidence that had initially seemed so damning started to be called into question. Forensic experts began to testify that the DNA evidence wasn't as conclusive as it had first seemed. The samples collected from the crime scene were flawed, and the methods used to gather and analyze the evidence were under scrutiny. The case was becoming more about doubts and contradictions than about facts. Yet, despite the growing uncertainty, the trial continued to unfold with increasing intensity. The stakes had never been higher for Amanda and Raffaele. Their lives, their futures, hung in the balance. Would they be convicted of Meredith's murder? Or would the case fall apart, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unspoken truths? The world was waiting for an answer. The trial of Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito had reached a fever pitch. The media coverage was relentless, with headlines across the globe proclaiming Amanda as a femme fatale and casting the entire case in an almost fictional light. But as the legal battle continued, a crucial phase was beginning: the appeal. And with it came new revelations that would cast doubt on much of the evidence that had initially seemed so compelling. The appeal process began in earnest in 2011, and it would introduce expert witnesses and forensic specialists who meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence. One of the first issues raised was the method by which DNA evidence had been collected. The forensic team hired by the defense argued that the DNA collection had been deeply flawed, leading to possible contamination. Their analysis called into question the very foundation of the prosecution's case, suggesting that the DNA linking Amanda and Raphael to the crime scene could not be trusted. This revelation was a bombshell. If the DNA evidence was unreliable, it stripped the case of one of its strongest points. Further complicating matters was the knife that had been presented as the possible murder weapon. During the initial investigation, a kitchen knife found at Raphael's apartment was seized as evidence, with traces of DNA linking both Amanda and Meredith. But the appeal introduced forensic experts who argued that the DNA on the knife was insufficient to be used as conclusive evidence. The experts explained that the samples were so small that they might have been remnants from other, unrelated contact. This new perspective introduced even more uncertainty into a case that had already been mired in doubt. One by one, key pieces of evidence began to crumble. The footprints found at the crime scene were re-examined, and new analyses suggested that they might not have belonged to either Amanda or Raphael. Additionally, a review of the crime scene photos revealed possible contamination and mishandling by investigators. Images showed that investigators had used the same gloves to handle multiple items without changing them, potentially compromising the integrity of the evidence. The defense used these oversights to argue that Amanda and Raphael's involvement had been fabricated by an overzealous prosecution. But if Amanda and Raphael hadn't killed Meredith, who had? Attention turned back to Rudy Gade, who had already been convicted in a separate trial. Unlike Amanda and Raphael, Gade's DNA had been found all over Meredith's room, including on her body and her belongings. He had initially denied any involvement, but his story changed over time, leading many to believe he knew more than he had initially let on. The defense argued that Gade acted alone, painting him as the sole culprit, and suggested that the prosecution's fixation on Amanda and Raphael had led them to overlook the possibility of Gade's sole guilt. As the appeal progressed, the Italian public watched closely, with opinions divided. Some viewed Amanda and Raphael as scapegoats, caught in a whirlwind of media scrutiny and legal errors. Others were convinced of their guilt, influenced by the persistent portrayal of Amanda as a figure of intrigue and mystery. But the evidence, or lack thereof, was beginning to tip the scales, and the growing doubts about the investigation's integrity became impossible to ignore. Amid this intense scrutiny, Amanda herself testified, describing in detail her experiences with the Italian justice system. She painted a harrowing picture of the night she was first questioned by police, detailing how she had been interrogated for hours without legal representation and felt pressured into providing a statement that she later recanted. This statement, which initially implicated her in the crime, had been a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Yet during the appeal, Amanda explained that she had been confused, disoriented, and had felt coerced during the interrogation. This added a new layer to her defense, suggesting that her initial confession had been made under extreme stress and should not have been considered reliable. After months of testimony, re-examinations, and heated debates, the appeal court reached a decision. In October 2011, Amanda and Raphael were acquitted of Meredith's murder. The court cited the lack of reliable evidence and the numerous procedural errors as reasons for overturning their convictions. It was a moment of triumph for Amanda and Raphael, but the case was far from over. The world was stunned by the acquittal, and reactions were polarized. Supporters celebrated their release, claiming it was proof that justice had been served. Others were outraged, seeing the decision as a failure of the justice system. The media frenzy only intensified, with Amanda becoming an even more controversial figure, as some hailed her as a symbol of wrongful accusation, while others questioned her innocence. Despite the acquittal, the case would continue to haunt Amanda and Raphael. Though Amanda Knox and Raphael Solacito had been acquitted in 2011, the relief was short-lived. In a surprising turn, Italy's highest court annulled the acquittal in 2013, ordering a retrial. The decision brought Amanda and Raphael back into the legal spotlight, reigniting public interest in the case and forcing them to face the possibility of returning to prison. Once again, the two found themselves entangled in a complex legal web, the outcome uncertain and the world watching. The retrial began in Florence, with a new set of judges and prosecutors determined to revisit the evidence and arguments. This time, the prosecution was prepared with a narrative that focused heavily on the forensic evidence, despite the concerns raised during the appeal. They argued that Amanda and Raphael had played a role in the crime, and that Rudy Ged, though convicted, hadn't acted alone. The prosecution maintained that the evidence, flawed as it was, still pointed to Amanda and Raphael's involvement. As the retrial unfolded, Amanda and Raphael's defense teams doubled down on the previous appeal's findings. They argued that the DNA evidence was unreliable and emphasized the lack of a clear motive, pointing out that both defendants had no history of violence and no reason to harm Meredith. Experts testified once again on the inadequacies of the forensic process, casting doubt on the validity of the prosecution's claims. This time, however, the stakes felt even higher. The prospect of a renewed conviction hung over Amanda and Raphael with an unbearable weight. For Amanda, who had returned to the United States after her acquittal, the retrial was especially excruciating. She chose not to attend in person, instead remaining in her home country and following the proceedings from afar. The retrial brought back memories of her initial arrest, the grueling interrogations, and the long months she had spent in an Italian prison. She now faced the horrifying possibility of being extradited back to Italy if convicted. Meanwhile, Raphael, who remained in Italy, chose to attend the hearings, attempting to defend himself against the renewed accusations. After months of contentious arguments and emotional testimony, the court reached a new decision in 2014. Amanda and Raphael were found guilty again. The verdict sent shockwaves through the media and left Amanda devastated. Her family vowed to fight the conviction, expressing their disbelief and frustration with the Italian judicial system. The ruling was met with mixed reactions worldwide. Some saw it as an affirmation of justice, while others viewed it as a severe miscarriage of justice, a refusal to let go of a flawed investigation. But this would not be the end. Amanda and Raphael appealed the conviction once more, bringing their case to Italy's Supreme Court in hopes of a final resolution. In 2015, the Supreme Court reviewed the case in light of all previous trials, appeals, and acquittals. The justices examined the extensive evidence, the procedural errors, and the countless inconsistencies that had marred the investigation. After thorough deliberation, the court made a historic decision. They fully exonerated Amanda Knox and Raphael, declaring them innocent of all charges related to Meredith's death. The Supreme Court's ruling marked the official end of a nearly 8-year legal saga that had seen Amanda and Raphael go from innocent students to global figures embroiled in a high-profile murder trial. The court's decision was final, affirming that the two had been wrongfully accused and clearing their names once and for all. For Amanda and Raphael, it was a bittersweet victory. They were finally free, but the years they had lost, the reputational damage, the trauma of imprisonment, and the ordeal of constant public scrutiny could never be fully undone. In the aftermath, Amanda sought to rebuild her life. She returned to the United States, where she worked to reclaim her narrative and advocate for others who had been wrongfully accused. Her story became a case study in the complexities and pitfalls of international justice systems, highlighting the dangers of media, sensationalism, and the psychological toll of prolonged legal battles. Raphael, too, found himself forever changed, working to recover from the trauma of the experience and reintegrate into a society that had watched him be tried and retried for years. Meanwhile, the murder of Meredith Kercher left a lasting impact on her family and friends. Her parents continued to mourn their loss, their grief compounded by the seemingly endless trials and appeals that had turned their daughter's memory into an international spectacle. For them, the case had been not only a devastating loss, but also a painful reminder of the limitations of justice, especially when clouded by media influence and public opinion. The case of Meredith Kercher would continue to haunt those involved, a cautionary tale of how complex legal systems, media scrutiny, and public opinion can alter lives irreparably. For many, the final verdict raised questions about truth, justice, and the price of innocence, leaving an indelible mark on all who had followed the story from its tragic beginning to its hard-won conclusion. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of Chill Thrill Stories. If these haunting and mysterious cases intrigue you, please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more content that explores the strange, dark, and mysterious. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. There's always more to uncover and discuss in the world of true crime and mystery. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay thrilled.